we're super excited to welcome in NHL.com senior fantasy editor Pete Jensen to talk a little bit of fantasy hockey. Pete, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Second year in a row. It was a blast coming on last year, and I'm even more optimistic about the Coyotes from a fantasy standpoint this season. So just a little preview here. You're going to hear a lot of good things. I think this could be maybe the most exciting Coyotes roster that they've assembled maybe ever. That's my personal opinion, but I'm excited about the ceiling.
Hot take.
Right off the top. I love it. Before we're going to ask you about Coyotes players, which Coyotes players have fantasy value, forwards, goalies, etc. Just in general, for those who are interested in fantasy hockey, just to summarize it, what's just a good strategy to draft a fantasy hockey team? Like what should be your strategy going into your fantasy draft?
Well, early on, you're going to want to hit on those 100-point scorers. There have been a lot more of them in recent years, so you definitely don't want to swing and miss like a lot of people did last season, let's say, on Jonathan Huberdeau, late first, early second round. Every once in a while, something with a new change of scenery. That's one thing I would say. Like, don't go too crazy about a guy that changed in the offseason, because sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it doesn't even end up working out at all, and then that player changes teams again the following season. So don't get too wrapped up in that. Take your safe picks early on, and then as it gets more interesting in the middle rounds, like look for those bargains. We're going to identify them on our podcast, NHL Fantasy on Ice, all off season long in September and October. The bargains based on average draft position, like where are these guys going? Should they be going higher than where they actually are? That's a huge thing in the middle rounds. And then late rounds, it's all those breakout sleepers, the rookies out there like Logan Cooley, I'm really excited about, Sean Dursey. Those type of guys fall into the sleeper category.
First, I want to know how I get the title senior fantasy editor on my title. I got to work on that. But in seriousness, so this is an interesting thing. We talked about Connor Bedard. Do you draft, or can you draft players that are on bad teams? And the player I look to the most this season is Connor Bedard. I mean, he's going to be on a bad team. Can you still get value in drafting players from bad teams?
Yeah, absolutely. If they're on the first power play, I mean, they're going to put up 20 plus power play points relative to where they're going in a draft, like pretty late. Like a lot of people think the Sharks are going to be bad this year because they traded Carlson to the Penguins. But that's not to say that guys like proven guys like Tomas Hertl, Logan Couture, even a young kid on the block like William Eklund, those guys could score 55, 60, 65 points. And maybe will hurt you a little bit in the plus minus category, but really produce in almost every category playing for a not so hot team. So to answer your question, I would not steer clear of some of those lower tier teams, because you could get a lot of fantasy value from them, especially if your league doesn't count plus minus against you. Then you're really talking, then you're diving into the Trevor Zegras and, some of the other teams out there, Johnny Gaudreau, Patrick Laine, Adam Fantilli, the rookie, if he makes the team for Columbus, even some of those guys on Philly, like Travis Konechny, if plus minus doesn't work against you, that could be a really, really valuable pick in your late rounds.
You just mentioned rookies, and I want to ask, obviously it's risky drafting rookies. A player like Connor Bedard, is a little bit of the exception, but generally where in your draft should you be targeting rookies? And I guess my second part of that question would be, where does Logan Cooley rank among this year's rookies?
So Connor Bedard is an exception to the rule. I'll usually say, don't take a rookie inside the top 100 overall. Even like Devin Levi, the goalie for the Sabres, I expect the Sabres to make a big jump this year. He's the second ranked rookie behind Bedard, but we have him at 101 in our rankings. We're not getting too in over our heads with him because, again, it's a team that hasn't made the playoffs in over a decade and stuff like that. Cooley, we have ranked fourth among rookies at the moment behind Connor Bedard and Devin Levi and Luke Hughes, the defenseman. But again, I wouldn't be surprised, especially if the wheels fall off around Connor Bedard and he doesn't have the supporting cast. I wouldn't be surprised to see Cooley put up 55, 60 points, and maybe Bedard puts up 65 or 70, and maybe we're talking about a little race here. So I think that Bedard is, everybody's calling him the lock to win the Calder, and that may be true, but whether it's Levi, Luke Hughes, or Cooley, I think we could have an interesting race as the season goes on. But with Connor Bedard, I mentioned he's an exception to the rule. I mean, we have him in the top 50 overall players, despite those team concerns that you mentioned just before. So that speaks a lot to the caliber of the prospect, historically speaking, and just the upside he has from the get-go with Taylor Hall and Seth Jones and a top-heavy team, let's say, in Chicago.
I want to make it real quick. I'm going to apologize for something I did on the internet, and it was targeted. I forget there's actual people on the internet. Sometimes it's just words. The NHL Fantasy put out these rookie ratings with Bedard, Levi, Hughes, Matty Nyes. The name we didn't see on there was Logan Cooley, so I was a smartass, and I said, someone missing? Smartass. And then you responded with, he's been added after he signed his contract because he hadn't signed yet. So I was a smartass. I apologize, Pete. I didn't mean to. I was just, Coyotes fans at it again. So I wanted to apologize to you on the air. But having said that now, so I've cleared the air. We talked about rookies. The other one, we talked about Devin Levi, but goalies can get you points. I mean, goalies can get you wins. When is a good time to look at getting a goalies, and give us your top 2 or 3 goalies this season?
Right. So, I mean, the top couple of goalies, they're all the Russian guys, right? There's Shesterkin, Sorokin, Vasilevsky. I mean, those guys are ridiculous year after year. After that, I would look at a Jake Ottinger. I feel like the Dallas Stars got even stronger this offseason. They're going to integrate a top prospect, most likely, Logan Stankoven. Keep an eye out for him in late rounds, whether he's on the second or third line. I really like that. They added Matt Duchene. Whether he plays center or wing, I really like that. I feel like Dallas is an even better team than last year on paper when they went to the Western Conference Final and ended up losing to the Golden Knights. But a really strong young core that's just going to keep getting better. So, yeah, those are the 4 best goalies in my opinion. Then there's a bit of a drop-off. So I'm going to go into drafts in my first couple of rounds and look at who goes first. Like if somebody takes Vasilevsky and Sorokin, I'll take Shesterkin shortly after. If those 3 go, maybe I'll take a chance and wait an extra round for Ottinger, but try to get one of those top 4 guys if you can, as long as you're not, I would not take a goalie in the first round. That has burned us in years past. So start in the second round, and maybe rounds 2, 3, and 4, try to get one of those top 4 goalies if you can.
Okay, we're going to move on to a name you've already mentioned a little bit already, but a defenseman that got over 100 points last year, and that's Erik Karlsson and his move to Pittsburgh. My concern is there's a lot of players on Pittsburgh that can get points. There's Crosby, there's Malkin, and I guess there's another guy that likes to play the power play in Chris Letang. So I'm wondering, do you anticipate another monster season for Erik Karlsson, or with all of that talent, the puck's got to get spread around somewhere? Is he maybe going to take a step backwards?
Right. We've been talking about quality versus quantity and how many cooks there are in the kitchen all off season long since this trade happened. I think it definitely reopens Pittsburgh's Stanley Cup window. But like we saw a couple of years ago with Brent Burns and Karlsson, like the ceilings fantasy wise that we were talking about and marveling about, they never actually happened. It was the year when Burns got traded to Carolina that Karlsson stayed healthy finally and popped off and scored 100 points, with a lot of those points coming in, garbage time situations. If the team was down 5-2 or 6-1 or whatever it was. I mean, let's be honest. I think the point total is coming a little bit down for Karlsson this year. The ice time, which is a load off his shoulders, is going to come down with Letang on the same team. But hey, Letang has missed time through the years for different situations. So, if Letang were to get injured, maybe we're talking about a ceiling of Karlsson having 90 or of 100 points. But we have him projected in the high 80s right now, which would probably still lead all defensemen. So, and look for a much better plus minus as well. But again, with all those guys passing the puck around, maybe he's going to lose out on some of those points that he would have gotten last year with the Sharks.
We're going to get into Coyotes specifically in a second. But before we do, I'm curious, from your point of view, who do you kind of have pegged as a potential breakout player across the NHL this season for fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch. I'm really excited about, some of I think like Pavel Zacha in Boston. I mean, he had career highs across the board last year, but you look at that roster compared to what it was last year, right? He'll probably remain with David Pastrnak, but he'll be their number one center unless they make a trade to address that. But they're kind of up against the salary cap and don't have a lot of wiggle room right now after Bergeron and Krejci retired this offseason. So I really like Pavel Zacha as like a full-fledged breakout candidate. For Buffalo, JJ Peterka, I know that they, already have their top-heavy lineup, but Peterka looks like a beast so far in his NHL career. And if he gets a little bit more power play time over maybe a Tuck or a Cousins or someone like that, I could see him having a monster season. And then, when you go deeper down the line, I think, there are a lot of bounce-back candidates on the Calgary Flames. I think maybe Lucas Reichel is another breakout candidate. If it ends up being Taylor Hall, Connor Bedard, and Lucas Reichel, he could be a breakout candidate and maybe go from next to nothing to 60, 65 points in a best case scenario, hitching on to the wagon that is Connor Bedard.
All right. Well, I want to get into Coyotes players specifically with you. And right before we went on air, we were talking about, the big step forward this team has taken, especially in this offseason. So I'm curious from you. I mean, Clayton Keller is kind of the obvious player when you look at the Coyotes roster as someone with fantasy value. But from your point of view, who else on this team is someone that, if you're drafting fantasy, you should look to on the Coyotes?
I actually like the 1-2 punch they have at center, assuming Cooley makes the team, and how well Barrett Hayton played down the stretch last year, near point per game player over the last month or so of the season. I think he had 18 in his final 20 or something like that. So playing with Keller and Nick Schmaltz. If Schmaltz stays healthy, I mean, this is a dangerous, robust Coyotes offense that I think a lot of teams out there might underestimate. I know they were a pretty competitive home team last year, but I could see them catching a lot of teams by surprise, especially in the Eastern Conference, and winning some big road games this year to get them into that fringe conversation for a second wild card spot in the Western Conference with teams like St. Louis and Nashville and Calgary that have been definitely trending down in recent years. So yeah, I would try to get a piece of that first power play. Like I said, Durzi, Cooley, Barrett Hayton. I like how they kind of supplemented the rest of their roster with guys like Dumba and guys like Zucker. I mean, these are high quality players that are going to make this team way more competitive right from the first puck drop in October early on. So yeah, I think they're going to catch a lot of people by surprise. And Clayton Keller, you mentioned, I mean, for us to have a Coyotes player in the top 50 overall certainly says a lot. They haven't had many in that realm, but Clayton Keller certainly deserves it. We have him projected for like 80 points this year, so we're taking him very, very seriously.
Well, that brings up one more name that hasn't been mentioned a lot. He finished fourth in the Calder voting last season. It was a rookie on this team who put up a lot of points, a lot of assists, and that's Matias Maccelli. Is he a guy that might be able to sneak into a later round, but still going to get you some value?
Definitely. The job he did in a secondary role, second power play, putting up that type of power play points, double digits, was really impressive as a rookie. So I'm interested to see, do they maybe even split up that top line trio and have, Maccelli elevated to play with Keller and Cooley, and then, have a nice, strong second line with Hayton and Schmaltz and try to keep that type of chemistry going from the tail end of last season. So, and again, there are like 3 fantasy relevant defensemen here in the mix, which we've seen in years past when they had, Ekman Larson and Yandel and Chikrin and Gostisbehere. And like, it's not unheard of to see a lot of fantasy appeal or production, regardless of what expectations were from the Coyotes defensemen. But yeah, you have Moser, you have Valimaki, and of course the big offseason acquisition in Durzi. Durzi's another guy, just like Maccelli, where he was on the second power play in LA and really was lighting it up for them. So now he doesn't have Doughty in front of him anymore. He has his own blue line to anchor and play with some young studs like Keller and Cooley. Could take him to the next level for fantasy.
So last question before we let you go, and it's about the Coyotes goalies, who Coyotes goalies historically overperform in some regard. And this year they're going with Kirill Vejmelka and Connor Ingram, who both had, pretty solid seasons last year. Obviously, they're not going to be your Vasilevskis, your Sorokins, etc. But as a secondary goalie, do you think it's worth going after one of these guys, or probably stay away, given the fact that the Coyotes, maybe their goal differential wasn't in the green last year?
Not their fault, by the way.
I mean, if he gets you like a .915 save percentage playing 50 games, like he played 50 games, started 49 last year, only had 18 wins, but did have 3 shutouts. And that's what I think we've seen from guys like Vejmelka and Ingram, especially last season. They stood on their head in a lot of games. Those home games at the ASU arena, I mean, they were like really acrobatic and very impressive based on a lot of people didn't think they would do so well in the goaltending department. So again, if you're a volume starter like Vejmelka playing that much in fantasy, you could actually be really valuable if you exceed expectations and you're taken, maybe in the last round of your fantasy draft, or maybe even picked up off the fantasy waiver wire, right? I wouldn't hesitate to take Vejmelka as like a 3rd or 4th fantasy goalie. And you never know, if you have another guy deal with an injury, you're going to want a guy playing for a competitive team, even if they don't make the playoffs. We have Arizona, I think, plus 7 or 8 wins compared to what they had last year, which would put them among the most improved teams this offseason, along with Columbus, who hopefully will be healthy. And they have a couple of young studs and Fantilli, like I mentioned, so into the mix. So right now, like big picture, the Coyotes have improved themselves maybe more than any team this offseason, but nobody's talking about it as much as they should, I feel.
That is fun. I will say this. It is. We live in a bubble here in Arizona. But clearly it's called the Coyotes Show. So we talk about Coyotes, and we see that they're making strides in the right direction. It's really nice to hear from a national perspective that someone else recognizes that the Coyotes are doing some good things.
Yep, definitely. Well, Pete, we can't thank you enough. This has been really great insight. Everyone can follow Pete at NHL Jensen. That's your at, right, on Twitter /X, whatever it is these days. But if you need any fantasy advice, and Pete obviously has the fantasy podcast as well, so lots of great insight there. But Pete, thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate your time, man.
Definitely appreciate you having me on. Yeah, check out nhl.com/fantasy. We got our cheat sheet, our projections for each team.
I always have it open.
Yeah, print that.
I always have it open.
I print since I'm old. You guys just put it on your phone.
Take the sleeper list into your draft, take your bargain list and all stuff like that, and cross names off our top 250 as they're drafted. And yeah, also check out the Instagram account for NHL Fantasy and myself, NHL Jensen, for a lot of videos leading up to the season. But thanks again for the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it.